Good evening. Welcome to the Wednesday, October 23rd meeting of the Moscow Planning and Zoning Commission. I'd like to begin with approval of the minutes from September 25th, our last meeting. Are there any additions, corrections, deletions? Do I hear a motion from anybody?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Thank you, Victory. Thank you, Rob. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions?
I'll abstain.
Okay. Item number 2 is public.
No, I don't have to. It's
You
just a
don't-
matter of form.
You don't have to. If you read the minutes, you don't have to.
Tradition.
Okay, moving on to item 2. It's an opportunity for public comment. There's no one in the audience tonight to speak to us about matters that aren't on the agenda or currently pending before us, but if any of you might be listening, if you'd like to do that sometime, come by and give it a try. Okay, item number 3 is a public hearing on a legislative amendment of Title IV, Chapter 3, to allow accessory dwelling units to have separate electric and water meters, and Mike Ray will give a presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Commissioners. Since these are a couple rather small amendments and ordinances, I've just combined them in the same presentation, but we can conduct 2 separate public hearings when it gets to that point. But the first is ADU electrical and water meter change and covered parking and miniature golf requirements within the city code. So the first one, we have a requirement that uses, buildings, and structures that utilize electricity and or water and are accessory to single-family or duplex residence shall be serviced by the same, it's kind of getting small. Serviced by the same electrical and or water meters as single-family or duplex residence. And then we added, I think this was the last time we updated the use table ordinance, which incorporated the limitations on use table. We added some flexibility to state that the zoning administrator may allow separate meters in the event that the distance between the principal use and the accessory use is determined to be exceptionally long. We've done that previously. And then we were going to add a sentence in there about accessory dwelling units are permitted to have separate meters. And the previous prohibition on accessory structures like garages or shops, having to run those from the principal structure is to pretty much control that accessory structure use. A lot of times it has a tendency of turning into more of a commercial use or another dwelling unit if it's separately metered. But in this case, accessory dwelling units are intended to be separate dwelling units. And so we're just proposing to make that change in order to allow it. We're also running into an issue that our electrical inspector brought up about panels and services on the house having to be upgraded, because essentially now you have 2 independent dwellings instead of everybody in the house and maybe somebody in the shop using electricity. Now you could potentially have 2 families both using electricity off of the same service. And so we're proposing to add that sentence in there to exempt out accessory dwelling units for the prohibition and allow them to have separate meters. And then the off-street parking change, there's a portion of our off-street parking standards that requires in R1 zones and then all other residential zones. So R1 zone, the required off-street parking for single-family dwelling, if it's not provided in a garage or carport, then it has to be located in it so that at a future date it may be covered. So essentially it just needs to meet accessory structure setback requirements, and they need to detail that on the plans, which parking space is going to be the covered parking space. And then in all other zoning districts, we require, if it's single-family or 2-family dwellings, if it's not provided in a garage or carport, then at least 1 has to be located so that at a future date it could be covered. And so really, it's just been problematic over the years when we administer this. People put that on the plans, but they really have no intention of covering it in the future. And really, we're just looking to make sure that they're satisfying the off-street parking requirements and don't really care if it's covered or not. And so In our review of other jurisdictions, we didn't find that any other jurisdiction really had a requirement like this, and so it's kind of unique to Moscow. And so we're proposing to eliminate that section requiring a covered space. And then the last amendment, I think I brought this up previously about miniature golf facilities. I think when we did the use table ordinance and restructured all of our parking requirements into the table format, we just ended up taking golf courses and country clubs and just transposing the 4 per hole over to miniature golf facilities. Not really thinking that we were going to get a miniature golf facility anytime soon, so I don't think we put a whole lot of thought into that. But you know, there was an inquiry recently about somebody doing that in one of the vacant buildings, and we just looked at the parking requirement, and just because of the different scale of those two uses and the land area that they typically take up, we thought it was more appropriate, and we did a quick review of other jurisdictions, and they all seem to be around the 1 or 1.5 parking spaces per hole requirement, and so we proposed to just make that minor change as part of this ordinance. So staff's recommendation is to conduct a public hearing on the proposed ordinances and recommend approval of the ordinances as presented. I'd certainly be able to answer any questions.
Okay, so would you like us to look at each one as a separate public hearing, or can we combine them?
I think we can probably combine them, but it might be cleaner just to do the separate.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so starting with, does anybody have any questions first about the accessory dwelling unit issues? Separate water meter, electric and water? Okay, does anybody have any questions for Mike about covered parking, elimination of that requirement?
So did you mark the edit?
I did, yeah.
Okay. And finally, about the reduction in parking requirement for miniature golf courses? Okay, so since we don't have any questions on those, I'll open the public hearing for the first item, which is the accessory dwelling units to have separate electric and water meters, that amendment to allow them to have that. And there's no one in the audience, so I'm assuming that we can just close the public hearing and we can vote on that one. Do I hear, or if there's any discussion, but since there weren't any questions, I'm assuming there's not much discussion either.
Mike, should we include all utilities? As far as like gas? I mean, is there
Right
any
now, gas,
restrictions
yeah,
on gas?
there's no restrictions on gas.
Okay.
So there was a couple instances where we looked at that. I think maybe you were involved in one of them, but yeah, it just specifically says water and electricity. So those would be the only stipulations on accessory structures right now. We would allow gas to have separate meters.
What about sewer? Okay.
We allow one connection. We don't require them to run separate lines right now, so.
But they can if they choose to?
Can if they want.
At a cost, I assume.
Correct,
Right.
yep.
Good questions. Any other questions or for Mike, or is there anyone prepared to make a motion to accept this change?
I move that we approve the accessory dwelling unit changes as presented.
Okay, thank you.
Second.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Rob. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. So there's no, other than we will recommend approval, and really there's no follow-up beyond that. So without modifications, I guess, so. Okay, public hearing number 2, the amendment to the, regarding the elimination of covered parking space requirement. Any discussion on that? Anybody want to venture a motion?
You can close the public hearing.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to open it. I opened and closed the public hearing because nobody is present. Thank you for the reminder on that. It's a little odd to be talking to chairs. There's no chairs, there's just chairs. Empty ones. Okay,
Well,
anyway.
I'll offer an amendment to approve the covered parking requirement changes as presented.
You'll offer a motion. Okay, is there a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Dennis. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, same thing, we recommend approval and as presented, so. It's a legislative change, so no further requirements there. And then finally, the parking requirement for chain reduction.
There's a-
included in that one.
Oh, it was, okay,
Yeah, it was-
apologies, okay.
Okay.
All right, so I guess we're good. A little bit.
And
Okay.
do we need to prepare reason statements?
No, not when it's a
Okay.
legislative
Okay.
change.
Okay.
Yeah,
About that,
at least that's my understanding, so. Okay, those were the quickest public hearings in history, I think. So, just a little too fast to think. All right, so Joel, we're already on item 5, which is the Transportation Commission
Well,
meetings report.
I missed the last transportation meeting. My understanding is that it was supposed to contain a presentation by the Affordable Housing. Well, it was supposed to receive a presentation from one of the other commissions, which didn't happen.
Oh, okay,
So I believe it was a short meeting.
okay.
And the next meeting will be on the second,
November 2nd?
well, the second Thursday of November, next month.
14th.
And I have not seen an agenda.
All right, thank you. Yes,
If I
Rob?
could, I wanted to pass on an observation and to Joel, if it's appropriate, and maybe something that you've already thought about with respect to transportation. But I just came back from a trip from sunshiny Southern California, which I'm always anxious to get home from. But I noticed something in some of the Southern California cities and also in Nevada that just really struck me. All their bike lanes, so you've got the two white stripes demarcating, center was painted green on all of them. And then before each intersection, they had green and white stripe so that it would, can't think of the word right now, but it would be a warning that you're coming to the intersection on the bike path. But what struck me as I was driving around these neighborhoods and some fairly busy streets was how visible that green stripe made the bike path, made it easier as a driver to navigate, and all the bicyclists and skateboarders and everybody else were really observing those stripes. So it really intrigued me
Yeah.
how much difference visually that made, and I thought I would pass it on during the transportation
So
discussion.
it's warning that you're coming to an intersection?
Yeah,
with a
what
green
they
stripe.
do is they from a solid green with the two side stripes, it goes then to a crossed white, green,
Oh.
about 3 sections just before the intersection, so that you at least visually see that you're coming up. And that was interesting, but the striking part was the blocks of the green stripes.
So green stripes instead of white stripes?
No, there was a white boundary, just like we have, except for where it's just pavement with the bicycle, or the rider emblems, that's green. That entire interior of the bike path.
Yeah, green is traditionally used for some of the bicycle marking, but to my understanding, at least in the Oregon example, it's used as safe boxes near intersections. And I think there's proposal to use some on Third Street. You
Is
have
that
any?
so you can wait in that
You
spot
can
and
wait
people
in that
turning
s-
right won't
right.
run into you?
Right.
Is that the purpose? Okay.
And
Hopefully.
in some cases, there is a green box ahead of the traffic. So you come up to a stop line, and there's a green stripe ahead of that to get the bikes out so they can get through the intersection first before the traffic behind them.
Okay, interesting.
Any comments for the use of green in bicycle markings?
I mean, I've seen them both ways, but I have seen the solid green. I recall that conversation a couple years ago, and I can't remember really what the consensus was, but I know part of it is probably just the upkeep of the paint
Yeah.
Yeah.
in those, I mean, it's hard enough to keep the lines up to date with their streets crew. And so I think part of that consideration is the maintenance of
I could-
repainting those areas.
I could see the visibility advantage of it down between the two white lines. Yeah.
No, it was striking, but Mike's right.
Yeah.
The maintenance certainly would
I
be-
think Portland uses green. I think you see it over there. They've got,
They use the
And-
boxes too.
It's more prevalent in communities that don't have to worry about road salt and
Snow.
snow plows
Snow
and
removal.
scraping it and
Right.
ruining it where it has to be reapplied. Because I know in
Right.
San Diego, they talk about only having to do that every fourth or fifth year.
Yeah. They'd be doing it every year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We fade
Because I know
out.
that was a point of conversation earlier. so.
I'll bring the question up in the transportation
Be curious, okay.
meeting.
Thank you. Didn't mean to
Yeah.
hijack a.
No, that's
Side
good. Did you have any reports from the airport, the deal from?
Oh, gosh. In fact, Connie and I were talking about that. Connie and Paul were the hosts for the airport runway opening ceremony on the 10th, and it was incredible. We were thinking 500 to 600 people probably attended, ribbon cutting.
And
we
bitter
had-
cold.
I'm sorry?
And bitter cold.
Cold,
Yeah.
but they had this wonderful tent out there that was actually set up on the old runway. It was stunning, and not only a good turnout, but a lot of interesting speakers, including from the congressional delegations, and it was marvelous. And for me, getting to see 20 years worth of
Yeah.
work actually come to fruition was almost overwhelming. But yeah, what an amazing asset that is for our community.
Yeah.
And I think that the thing that really strikes me, and it's unique almost in the country, was how two communities, Moscow Pullman, two universities, two counties, a port, and our congressional, everybody worked together to make this happen. And even the people from the Washington, D.C. And FAA were remarking on how unique it was to see communities come together. I mean, you can't do a $154 million project without everybody working together, but it was remarkable. Yeah, it was a pretty overwhelming day, but Connie and Paul did such an amazing job to
you.
put the event together.
Well, congratulations to both of you.
Thanks.
So,
I would just make a little comment that at the Water Summit, the people who come in always say the same thing, how amazing it is that the two communities in the region work together.
oh yeah, that's nice.
I think we're getting known for it.
Oh, good. Okay, well, are there any other announcements for the last item here on the agenda? Okay, well, before I close the meeting and we move on to continuing education, where we're actually going to view the second half of the YouTube on Living Tiny Legally, which we can't show over, is available for anybody who might be listening to just go onto YouTube and look it up, and you can watch it. It's about an hour long. We're going to view it as a commission as part of our continuing ed program, and then have a discussion afterwards. So I will adjourn the formal meeting, and we will move into that.
and I just had a comment as we watch it. I haven't responded to this yet, but apparently the Science Center, sponsored by folks over in Pullman, you know, the science, the Kids Science Center.
Discovery
Apparently
or-
they're interested in the tiny house idea and want to try and encourage a tiny house for kids to spread the idea. And I'll give you a better report in our next meeting. I just got an email from somebody on that committee. Anyway, it might, I was just thinking it might give us a different perspective to think of doing some publicity about what the tiny house thing is. It might, who knows, it might get more serious than we think. So anyway, I haven't talked to the people that, somebody called me up and said, would I would be willing to help on designing one of these tiny houses for the kids. But, you know, if you get the kids talking about it, oftentimes that catches the attention of the people who have kids. So anyway, I'm anxious to see the second half.
Okay, well, so ask Zach to